university studies at Dartmouth University and did a residency at the University of Connecticut. And then he had several experiences or professional experiences, including time with the Indian Health Service in Wyoming and private medical practice before coming to Socorro in 1999. He's a member of the Alpha Omega Alpha, which is the Medical Honorary Society, and he has been elected a Fellow of the American Association of Family Practice. He's been working as a physician at the Socorro Hospital Emergency Room since 1999 and is a resident of Catron County. And this evening he's going to be speaking to us on Intelligently Designed the Human Body. Dr. Bassler.
Thank you. So I'm glad to see so many people here this evening. My comments were going to be addressing both of you, but it turned out to be better than that. I want you to do something for me real quick, okay? This is easy. I think all of you can do this, okay? So I want you to look at your hand. I want you to stretch it out, okay? Then I want you to flex it, make a fist. Stretch it out, turn it over, make a fist, stretch it out. If you want to keep doing that, you may, but you don't have to. I think everybody passed, so that's a good thing. So the question I have for you is, how did you do that? You ever think about that? How did you do that? What's involved in being able to get the message from the brain through the nervous system, through the motor end plate, to the muscle fibers, to get them to contract and then relax, all volitionally? And another question, do you have to think about it to do it? You ever eaten food and talked to a friend at the same time? Imagine that, being able to do that. I need to move over because what? Well, you don't need to see the screen yet. I'll let you know when you need to see the screen. That's my wife, by the way.
I am going to scoot that out.
Okay. 44 years of keeping me honest, and she's still having troubles. All right. So, the question that we're trying to address this evening is, how did this complexity develop? Okay. We're going to take a brief journey. I had a subtitle for this, and it's Medical School in an Hour. But I presented this to myself about 4 times, and I kept falling asleep about halfway through. It's too much information. That, by the way, that mirrors medical school pretty well. Falling asleep halfway through. So I've tried to tone it down a little bit. I'm going to be skipping over stuff that, depending on how our time goes, that maybe is not quite as germane. But I do want us to consider this idea of complexity. Is there really some design involved here? Is there something that goes beyond the material world having caused us to be here in this level of complexity? Or are we really just a happenstance? Now, I've been dealing with this complex organism, as Fred was relating, for about 39 years. I started medical school 39 years ago. And I've had quite a bit of opportunity to, and quite a bit of privilege to be able to interact with the human body and see how it works, and sometimes see how it dysfunctions. I'm kind of puzzled, though, sometimes at how little regard many of us give for this human body that we inhabit. In fact, I've been pretty impressed at how hard people try to figure out how much abuse the human body can take and still function. Some people are really dedicated to this concept of abusing it and seeing if it will tolerate yet again another weekend of drunkenness, or another bicycle accident coming down off Baldy Mountain, whatever it is. So people tend to take it for granted. So I want us not to take it for granted this evening, just for an hour or so. Not to take it for granted, but to think about this, okay? Because what we're talking about this evening is the most important entity in the known, I'll put in there the known universe. And what is that? It is you. The most important entity, the most complex entity in the known universe. And when I say you, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about you and you and you and you, the individual yous that we are. So again, I want you to look at this through your own eyes as we're talking about this. And I hope that we can have a little bit of fun with this at the same time. But there is a lot of material here that I want to try to cover with us. And what I want you to sort of contemplate is, can I have the next slide, please? I have to remember, I'm trying to coordinate this. Okay, so the title of the topic is Intelligently Design the Human Body. And I probably would have titled it myself, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. Fearful doesn't quite do it for us these days, because fear, in the biblical sense, means awe. It means having a reverence for something. And so fear suggests something different. But if I changed it to awfully made, that doesn't work so well either, because we've changed what awful means. So I stuck in there awesomely. We're awesomely and wonderfully made. So at the end of this talk, and as we're going through it, I want you to think, is there really some basis for thinking that we are awesomely and wonderfully made? Is there some marvel that we can see in this human body? And before we launch into it, it was suggested that I probably tell you a little bit about my faith background, just so you know where I'm coming from. All right? So, just briefly, I was brought up Catholic. I went to college, and I decided that God, I really didn't need the God thing, and I decided I was an atheist. And so I told God that He did not exist, and I was hoping that He would take this to heart. So for about 10 years, I wandered through this sort of I don't believe in God thing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, God didn't go away. So I have to confess to you this evening that I am a backslidden atheist. So my faith background now is that I am a Christ follower. My current flavor is Baptist, but don't hold that against me. I mean, Christ humbled Himself to come to the earth. He certainly could humble Himself to go to a Baptist church. Okay, so I praise You because I am fearfully and wonderfully made, is what the psalmist wrote. And Sir J. Arthur Thompson, a biologist, apparently from England, said that the body is a self-building, and I would put in there a self-replicating, self-building machine, self-stoking, self-regulating, self-repairing, the most marvelous and unique automatic mechanism in the, and I put in parentheses, known universe. Because maybe someday somebody will come from another planet and say, I'm smarter than you are. But for now, this seems to be it. Can I have the next slide? Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to mention just briefly, More Than Meets the Eye is a little book by Richard Swenson, a physician, but also trained as a physicist. And this little book, it's just a fun read if you want to get into more of the details of the human body, but also of the conditions of the universe that have to apply to allow life to be able to exist on this earth. So it's easy to read. He's got a good sense of humor. I've taken a lot of stuff from that book as well as some other sources, but I'd recommend this to you highly. And just while we're mentioning that, there is a bibliography, a little annotated bibliography on the back table, if you'd like to pick that up. Okay, next slide. So Mother Goose says, Grinny, where did you bite the mailman? And Grinny says, on the gazebo. And he says, and I just love medical terminology. And the reason I put this in here is that that's sort of my bent, and I tend to, when I don't know what I'm talking about, I tend to fall back into medical terminology because most people don't know if I know what I'm talking about or not. So I'm going to try to stay away from that, but if I lapse into it, either apologize or raise your hand and say cut it out. Okay, next slide please. So I promised you in the little blurb that came out that we're going to talk about the human body starting at the atomic level and then at the biochemical or molecular level, cellular level, and then the organ level, try to put the whole body together. Well, that was a pretty stupid idea, but here we are. I've got to do it because I said I would. So the atomic level, we're just going to talk about very briefly. I think there's a... Whoops. Was there wasn't a picture slide that goes with the last one? There it is, okay. So, this is what the atom used to be when there was some semblance of order in our world. Now we know that this is way oversimplified. But I just want to bring this up. The atomic level is just kind of neat, and we don't need to say too much about it, except that the body is made up of 10 to the 28th, which is a lot, of atoms. 10 to the 28th atoms. Now, to give you some sense of comparison in the universe, astrophysicists like my friend Raoul will tell us there are somewhere between 10 to the 20th and 10 to the 24th stars. So imagine it. We are somewhere between 1,000 and a million or 10,000 million times more complex than the universe. You know, we hear about multiverses now. I think each one of you is a little universe, and we're a multiverse sitting here. So we're about 1 million times more complicated than the universe. And I think that's why some doctors make more money than astrophysicists do. Because we're dealing with such a higher level of complexity, no offense. Okay, so now, there have been isotope studies done about the atoms in the human body. And isotope studies, it's another word for magic. I really don't understand exactly isotope studies, but what they tell us, and they have to be right, is that 90% of our atoms are replaced every year. 90%. And within 5 years, 100%. Some of the atoms are a little more tightly bound in the bone, structures like that. So that means that every 5 years, you're basically a new person. In fact, during this talk, you will replace 1 trillion, I think it's 1 trillion trillion, yes, 1 trillion trillion of your atoms will be replaced. And guess who you're sharing it with? You know, when John Donne said no man is an island, he wasn't kidding. We are the world, you know. We are all of each other, whether we like it or not. 1 trillion trillion of your atoms are going to be exchanged during this hour. So 5 years. Now, I had a fellow come into the office one time, he's kind of despondent, young fella, and he said, I'm feeling down. I said, well, what's the problem? He says, my wife tells me I'm not the man I used to be. I said, well, how long have you been married? 5 years. I said, well, you go and tell your wife that she's not the woman you married either. This is why I did not do couples counseling. Okay, so all of this exchange that's going on right now in this room, you're very intimately involved in. You know, this really isn't supposed to be an X-rated lecture, but we are going through this exchange. So, this led a Dr. Bohan to say that we're continually being recreated from dust, returning to dust. We're patterns that have the capacity to perpetuate ourselves. We're not things, we are processes. Buckminster Fuller said, I seem to be a verb. And I think that's a pretty good summation. There's an interesting little verse in Colossians, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's 1:17, and it says, in him, Christ, all things hold together. And I think that there's a real theologic basis for this, because if we're expelling 100 trillion cells per hour, right, there better be something that's kind of keeping us together. Otherwise, we're just going to fly off into the atmosphere. We're just going to disintegrate. So I think that there, theologically, my own feeling is that there is something that keeps all of this activity still in a form. I mean, my wife still recognizes me after 44 years. I haven't totally disintegrated, although she does say I'm not the man I used to be. But there's something holding us together. So that's Colossians. Now in Genesis 3:18, right? What did God say? He said, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. Profound comment. And the Apostle Paul in the Corinthians, it was 4:16, 2 Corinthians 4:16, and I kind of like this one at my age. It says, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. Now he was talking spiritually, right? Inwardly. But there is, atomically, a basis for this, that we are being renewed day by day. But unfortunately, externally, we are wasting away. And we'll leave that where it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we are. This is us. Okay, now remember, this talk is about you. If you start getting bored, it's about you. And what does that mean about you as a person? All right, never mind. We'll just keep moving. Okay. So, now we're kind of moving up to the biochemical level. Did we skip that slide or was that on there before? Doesn't matter. We're going to kind of, the biochemical and cellular level are going to overlap a bit, okay? Can't quite keep this separate. So this anyways, this is a picture of a human zygote, a fertilized egg. It does not come actually with a red circle on it. But this is the area where the chromosomes are, the genome, the nuclear material. And remember from way back in biology that we start as the union between the DNA in an egg and the DNA in a sperm. We have 46 chromosomes, right? The genetic material, 23 come from the mom, 23 from the dad. And that gives us a complement of 46. The female has 2 X chromosomes, so she always contributes an X to the equation. The male has an X and a Y, so he contributes an X or a Y chromosome, so male or female. And it's kind of interesting that even at the cellular level, we can see the makings of adult human beings. Because the egg, although it's small, less than a dot at the end of a period, it still is full of nutrients and energy-producing mitochondria. And the sperm is like, look, I just beat out 200 million guys. I'm competitive. I made it. This is what you get. I'm done. Right? But the egg is nurturing and soft and cuddly, like we hope our mom is. All right, so even back here, we see the makings of what's going to happen. Next slide, please. So here's a human genome. These chromosomes actually have been teased out of a human cell, and they've been paired up together. So we know that one is from the mom, one is from the dad, all the way through. We get down here, which kind of organism did this come from? Male, right? Because we have an X chromosome and a Y. Isn't it interesting that the Y chromosome is small like that? Now, a woman has 2 X's, you know, so it's no wonder they can multitask. Right? But us poor guys, here we are, this little... Anyway, so... right, so we... Okay, so we talked about the 20... okay, so here's what I want you to think about. This is probably the most important thing the whole evening. So if you have some place to go, just wait a minute and then it'll be fine. Think about this for a minute. Go back to that other slide. Okay. Look at your neighbor. Okay? And you can say, depending on who it is, hello, Mr. or Ms. Zygote. Okay? Because this is how each one of us started. Each one of us started as a single cell. And do you know that all the information necessary to create this complex body that you live in, all the information is right there to make the unique you that you are. 7 billion people in the world, no 2 are exactly the same. And we'll talk about why in a second. But all the information is there. You can take this little booger and you can freeze them up and keep them there for a few years, take them back out, thaw them out, stimulate it, it will turn into that individual that's programmed by that nuclear material. Of course, when it's born, it's going to say, why did you freeze me? That was not nice. But all the information is there. That's what I want you to think about. This is so incomprehensible that all the information to make the complete organism is present in that first cell. Think about it. 200 different cellular types and tissues are going to arise from the information in that one cell. And all those cells are going to have to learn how to work together so that we can do these kind of things that we were talking about, and much more complicated things than that. This cell is going to give rise to an organism that has 10 to 100 trillion cells in it. 10 to 100 trillion. I guess it depends on whether you're Pee Wee Herman or Arnold Schwarzenegger. 10 to 100. But I think really the problem is that we haven't found a graduate student yet willing to count all the cells in the human body, although I think that should be a requirement for somebody to have to do that. So somewhere between 10 and 100 trillion cells. Okay, and we said that they have to work in harmony to do these things. Okay, so again, this is how you started out. You know, you must have been a beautiful baby, right? This is how it all started out. The individual us, it's all there. How does that information get there? Okay, next one. I shall be the next one after this. Oh! So what happens to that little one cell thing, right? 9 months later, oh. I mean, is that a miracle or is that not a miracle? How does that happen from one cell with just the information in that cell producing this beautiful baby? How does that happen? Incredible. Just incredible to think about. Okay, so let's do the next one. Okay, biochemistry DNA. I've got about an hour and a half on this, okay? So I will try to cut it back a little bit. But all I'm trying to tell you is that this is so complex, I can't really do this in the 10 minutes that I have. But we're going to talk a little bit about it anyway. So if you'll give me the next slide here. Okay, so we know in 1955, Watson and Crick published the article that talked to us about the double helix DNA. And this is the information code that's in that initial cell. All the information, all the blueprint needed to make you was right there in that DNA in that first cell. We all know that, right? But do we think about it? Okay, now just looking at this, so the DNA is, it contains 4 letters, basically. A, C, G, and T. And this is a C and a G, obviously. And these are, the little green things are the hydrogen bonds. That's what holds the chains together. So the blue and the yellow, there's a hydrogen bond between each of those. That's what holds it together. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're talking about the human genome. And let me just see what I got here. Why don't you go ahead to the next slide if you would. Okay, so this is that picture again. Now we see this is the cell, the nucleus, the chromosomes, right? Chromosomes are these little X-looking things here. And they start to uncoil a chromosome, and out comes this strand of DNA. So the thing about the chromosome is this is our DNA packaged. It's packaged, okay? And that's the epigenetics that my sister and I were talking about a little while ago, is that the way it's packaged determines which part of the information is going to be utilized in a particular type of cell. Different cells don't use all of the information, they use parts of the information. What are they using information for? They use it to make proteins, which very nicely are colored, green and red and blue. And sometimes they function independently, sometimes they come together to form a molecule that has several parts to it. The thing about protein, well, we'll get there in a minute. Okay, so let's see, try the next slide if you would. Let me see what it is. Yeah, okay. So here's the DNA, right? Here's the double helix. And it's being pulled apart and it's being replicated. Okay, so we have a C. We know that a C is going to have a G come in there. We have a T. We know an A is going to come in there. That's what's happening as the DNA is being replicated, reproduced. But there's another thing that happens when this is pulled apart, depending on which protein comes into play, and that is that the DNA sequence may be converted to messenger RNA, which is down here. And you'll see that the DNA, oh, I was going to tell you to shut your cell phones off now. I used to tell people to put them on vibrate, but when I put mine on vibrate, I'm kind of bony. And if it goes off, I always say, what the heck was that? Which seems to be as disruptive as having it. So anyway, we have 3-letter codes. These are the words of the DNA information. 3-letter words. Each 3 letters codes for an amino acid. Think of an amino acid as a Lego. Okay? So Legos are going to come together to make up proteins. So this is very important, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So we have the 4 letters, and you can see again, CGTA, 4 of them. This is the DNA. Okay, let's see. You can go ahead to the next one. But while we're talking about the human genome, how is it that there's so much information there? Well, the reason is because there are 3 billion base pairs in the DNA in that one cell. 3 billion. Now, if you divide that by 3, because each word is 3 letters long, that's still 1 billion different words that this is coding for. If you were to take that DNA out of that egg, that zygote, and if you could attach all of the DNA together, end to end, and stretch it out, you'd have a strand somewhere between 3 and 5 feet long. But it'd be 1/50 trillionth of an inch wide, and it would weigh 0.2 millionth of a millionth of an ounce. All the information to make you amounts to 0.2 millionth of a millionth of an ounce. So that's either a lot of information or you're not so much as we thought. So now we're going to go ahead and make proteins. And come on. Okay. So the DNA separates, takes proteins to do that. Proteins are complex, we'll talk about that. To pull that strand apart. It takes another protein to cause the DNA to be made into mRNA, the mirror image, as opposed to more DNA. Different proteins do different things. The mRNA, the DNA wants to stay in the nucleus. It's kind of a homebody. The mRNA doesn't mind going out into the cytoplasm, where there are these little green wavy guys called ribosomes. The mRNA is a big long strand because it's been copied from the DNA. 3-letter words copied from the DNA. 3-letter words. Okay, so you see there are 3 little pink guys there. Okay, that's a word. So that word is going to match up with one of these things. That's a tRNA. So that's RNA with a protein that's got 3 letters exposed, and it codes for, or it's shaped to catch, a particular LEGO, particular amino acid. So when it has that amino acid, it gets sucked down here to the mRNA. It's got a little blocker thing there to keep it from matching up where it's not supposed to, and that's stripped off, and it comes in and it sticks right onto the mRNA, brings the amino acid LEGO in. There's an enzyme here that attaches it to the growing protein chain. And then this tRNA is released to go back and find another amino acid specific for the type transfer RNA it is. The next one comes in that will match up here. How does it do that? How do you do that? And yet, you're doing it right now. Because right now, you're going to make, in the next second or so, 5 billion platelets. In the next second. This is happening a lot. Every second, all the time. All this information, all this complexity. How does this happen by chance? Even if you go back to a bacteria, the smallest organism possible. There have been some scientists who said, how small can we make a living thing? They took an E. coli, they stripped away as many genes as they could and had the thing still reproduce and live. It had 450 genes to start with. They got it down to 370 genes. Pretty good. That's 370 different proteins for that organism, that simplest of organisms, to be alive. How do we get the information for 20 to 25,000 different proteins that our bodies have? How do you do that? Just very quickly, go to the next slide. I have to skip over this quickly, but, I'm sorry, go to the next one after this. All right, so what happens if there's a mistake? We have a protein in our bodies called hemoglobin. Okay? It's made up of 4 chains, 2 alpha, 2 beta. The alphas are 141 amino acids long, the betas are 146 amino acids long. There's a problem for some people. 1 letter of the DNA for the alpha chain, which is 141 amino acids long, 1 letter got miscopied. 1 letter. What happened? As a result of that, instead of a glutamate here, we get a valine. Glutamates love each other. They like to hug. And we get these nice little globulins. But the valines are haters. And they push apart. And as a result of that, instead of these nice little blobby things, we get chains of hemoglobin. They clump together. Next slide, please. When that happens, the normal nice little disc throat lozenge cells here, the red blood cells, that are a little bit squishy, and they can squish through the little tiny capillaries if they have to, if it's that narrow. The hemoglobin forms chains, and the chains are stiff. And the stiff chains make the cells sickle, and they don't bend. And they get to these little places in the capillary where they need to be able to bend, and they get stuck. And this is called sickle cell anemia. And it's a terrible disease, especially untreated. Because what happens if a part of the body doesn't get the oxygen it needs? It dies. And you know what happens when tissue dies? It screams. And these people, when they come in what's called sickle crisis, they're literally screaming because parts of their body aren't getting oxygen. One letter causing one wrong amino acid in a chain of 141 amino acids. And it's lethal to the organism. How is that much information available? And what happens if we don't have the information? How is the protein possibly going to come together? In fact, scientists, the theoretical mathematicians have looked at this, and they've said that if you took sufficient quantity of amino acids and you put them in a little bath, gamish, and there's a little bit of energy around, and you let them just come together randomly, what are the chances of forming a functional hemoglobin molecule? You know what the chances are? Mathematically. 10 to the 850th. Now that, my friends, that's a small chance. Because astrophysicists tell us there are approximately 10 to the 80th particles in the universe. 10 to the 80th particles in the universe. And yet the chances of this are 10 to the 850th. Smaller proteins, they've calculated 10 to the 164th. How do functioning proteins occur that allow life to exist? And especially, how does the information in the first place develop that allows these proteins to occur? How did you do that? You guys are amazing. All right. Next slide. So Bill Gates, most of us have heard of him, said DNA is like a software program, only much more advanced than any we have ever created. And as far as what I've read about Bill Gates, for him to admit anything is beyond his ability is unusual. Francis Crick, Watson and Crick, double helix, he is a confirmed evolutionist, no friend of theology. And yet he said a structure like DNA could never have emerged by chance, although he doesn't say really how he thinks it did. He says an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears almost a miracle. And then at some point he said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed. It evolved. Come on. Don't pay any, it's like the Wizard of Oz. Don't pay any attention to the man behind the curtain. Right? Just look at the wizard. Right? It's the same thing. It's all this, it looks designed. It looks like somebody was trying. But no, it's all chance. So let me say right now, in case I forget to say it later, science is not the enemy of theology. Science, all the knowledge in the world, will never get you to believe in God. I cannot convince you by all the words I say to believe in God. But if you believe in God, science will not disabuse you of that belief. Okay? Faith is something different. Faith is something that is a gift to us. Okay. So let's go real quick. Cells. Next slide. Cell organelles. Man, we are not going to spend time on this. Next slide. There's a cell. There are the organelles. Only to show you that the structure of the cell is extremely complex. It's not like Darwin thought, because he only had simple microscopes, a nucleus with maybe a little blot in it called the nucleolus, and some jelly-like gamish there that has some little dots in it, and then a little saran wrap covering around it called the cell membrane. That's not what it is. It's all of this. It's the nucleus. It's the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes that help to make the proteins, the Golgi bodies that export the proteins, the mitochondria that are the energy factors for the cell. Next slide. And the cell membrane is not a little piece of saran wrap. It's a biphospholipid layer that has all these different proteins that go through it. Now, these proteins, the blue things here, they're different kinds. Each one of these proteins, remember, has to be coded for in the DNA. It's complex. So, some of these are little channels. They let specific kinds of molecules in. Small proteins, hormones. Others are gated, and they're triggered by electrical impulses that allow the gate to open. And they have little pumps that pump sodium ions in, chloride ions out, allows the membrane to develop an electrical potential, which is the way our nerve cells function, electricity. Not simple. Okay, next. Wow, so we did good with that one. That's the only one we've done well with so far. So organs, there's a lot. Okay, there's a bunch of them. And you all know most of this anyway, but we'll just take a couple here real quick. Some of our favorites, the heart and the vascular system. And I could tell you a lot about this, like it weighs 10 ounces and it beats 100,000 times a day and 2.5 billion times a lifetime. And if we looked at it, the heart, if you live long enough, would pump about 6,000 of those 10,000-gallon tanker trucks of blood in a lifetime, 6,000 of them. But I'm not going to tell you that, because that's just numbers, and you won't appreciate it. But the neat thing about the heart is that it never takes, we hope, a vacation all that time. It's only about 10% mechanically efficient, according to the engineers looking at it, and yet its faithfulness is priceless, right? It just does this day in and day out, whether we're awake or whether we're asleep. It just keeps going. I could tell you that the human body has 60,000 miles of blood vessels, mostly the capillaries, the very small ones. But if I did that, that would bore you. And that the surface area they provide is 70,000 square feet for exchanging nutrients, for getting oxygen where it belongs, and sugar, and other nutrients where it belongs, and getting rid of the waste. 70,000 square feet, that's bigger than Bill Gates' house. And actually, if you think that an acre is 43,000 square feet, that's about 1.5 acres of surface area inside you that's carrying on this exchange. How do you do that? All right. Let's see. And then, of course, in the blood, there are all these blood... Go ahead to the next slide, see what we got. So there's the heart, and the next one is the heart. And, okay, next one. Okay, so then we have the blood vessels, and we have the arteries, and they branch down into the little capillaries, and that's where all the good stuff gets exchanged, and then it flows back into the veins, back to the heart, circulate around. A red blood cell makes its trip from the heart back to the heart in about a minute, every minute. But the blood also, it's made up of components, right? We know that. It's got the serum, which is kind of the liquidy stuff, kind of yellow looking. But it's got red blood cells. They carry the oxygen. It's got white blood cells. They fight off things that don't belong there. Okay? Bacteria, viruses. Very complex process. I could tell you that there are 100 billion molecular receptors on white cells to recognize proteins that don't belong there from bacteria or viruses, but if I did, I would bore you. But how does this happen that a white blood cell that's never seen this kind of protein before in its existence can recognize it as foreign, and not only that, but then make a protein called an antibody that will attach to the bacteria so that the rest of the white blood cells recognize it doesn't belong there and they'll kill it. How does it do that? It's never seen it before. That's an amazing amount of information to be able to digest that and make something that will protect our bodies. You know, my mom was a very wise woman, and she used to say, if you eat a little bit of dirt every day, you'll be better for it. And she was right. Because what does it do? It exposes us early on to different antigens, so our immune system kind of gets geared up. And I could tell you that, you know, there are 5, I forget. There's like 100 billion white blood cells circulating around all the time, right? So they're just kind of, they're the Navy SEALs, right? But when they find something, guess what they do? They dial up the reinforcements. We've got 5 trillion National Guard waiting just to join in the battle. So when those bacteria get in, they got a tough time ahead of them. Sometimes they get the best of us, but a lot of times they don't, whether they have a doctor or not. You know what Voltaire said about a doctor? He said, a doctor is there to amuse the patient while nature heals the body. Okay, what do we have for our next slide? Blood components. Okay. So we have the nice little red donuts. Those are the red blood cells. Teaspoon of blood, 25 billion red cells in a teaspoon of blood. 25 billion. So you're making these all the time. Now these last about 120 days after you make them, and then they're gradually cleared out. The old ones, new ones come in, sort of like life. Here we have a picture of 3 components, blood cells in the bloodstream, and there's a red cell. This hairy one is a white cell with the little things getting ready to check for the antigens, and a platelet, which is kind of hairy to stick together, so that if we cut ourselves and there's tissue exposed, the platelets come in there and they kind of latch onto that. They're the sacrificial ones. They give their lives for the cause all the time, because when they do this, they're going to die for the cause of clotting. I had a slide about the clotting mechanism, which thank God I'm not going to show you. But there are 13 proteins involved in it, and once the platelets start sticking together, they release substances that cause the clotting mechanism to start going. So when you cut yourself, let me ask you a question. Why don't you turn into one big clot? Sure, don't know. Well, read about it, you'll find out. But I will say that it has something to do with feedback mechanisms. So as the cascade's activated, it also activates other substances that come back and tone down the clot. And guess what? If you have a mistake in your DNA and you're missing an S protein, guess what's going to happen? You're going to clot too much. Right, but if you don't have enough of factor 8 or factor 13, guess what's going to happen? You're going to bleed all the time. Hemophilia, King's disease, right? It's all the inbreeding. It only happened to males because of the XY chromosome thing and where that's found. And so in that kingly line, there was a lot of hemophilia that got passed on generation to generation. So you bleed too much. Okay, next slide. 5 million new platelets every second. So you've been busy. You've been busy. Okay, next. And then we get to the lungs, respiratory system. There's nothing awfully exciting about this, but there are just a couple of things that I like about it. Again, you have the little air sacs. If you open them all up, you'd have a half tennis court of surface area to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, we breathe 23,000 times a day. 23,000. How many times did you have to think about doing that? You know, if you had to think about every breath, you wouldn't have time to do a lot else. But the other thing that's interesting is you can determine if you're going to breathe or not, right? So you can use your higher functions. Like, as a doctor, I'm always telling people, take a deep breath, right? And then what do I say after that? Because people want to keep until I pass out. So now I say, breathe normally. You know how hard that is to do? If somebody tells you to breathe normally, you start thinking, what's normal? I don't think about this very much. I'm not sure what normal is. And people get very confused. So 23,000 times a day, that's 22 pounds of air. No wonder we have so much trouble losing weight. And I don't mean to cast aspersions, but I think some of you people have been hyperventilating a bit. But the thing I like about this whole thing, though, is, you know, we do live in a recycled environment. And just like you're exchanging hundreds of trillions of atoms with your neighbor just to be friendly, we also are exchanging air with our neighbors, but also with people who have gone before. If you think of Avogadro's number of atoms in each liter of air that we breathe, there's about 100 million atoms that we breathe in from every individual that lives. So if you think of somebody in history that you're really fond of, take a big breath. And you will share 100 million of the atoms that that person breathed. And I think, again, as a Christian, and I know not necessarily everybody here believes this, but if God came to earth as Christ, think about how intimately involved he is with us on a very physical, day-to-day basis. Take a deep breath, breathe Christ in. He's intimately involved with us. It says God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Where did life come from? Did it really come from just a gemisch of muddy stuff that somehow said, oh, I think I want to be a bacteria? Knowing that one chance in 10 to the 164th for one functional protein to develop. Did that happen? And of course the psalmist says, let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Next slide. A few others in brief. Well, go ahead. Next slide. Okay, this is all we're going to talk about. Okay, so this is the digestive system. And the one thing we need to point out is the liver. Oh my gosh. This is the body's factory. This is the mega factory. It has 500 different functions. And it clears all kinds of toxins from your blood. And people are always trying to prove this. They go out on the weekend and they drink like a keg. And they say, I want to see if my liver can really handle this. You know? And they take in other substances that are not naturally occurring. And they want to see if their liver can handle it. And most of the times, their liver can handle it. At least for sometimes, after 20 years of it, it gets tired. But for the most part, it does yeoman's duty. All these different functions. Making hormones, controlling cholesterol, making red cells in the developing baby. We already talked about clearing toxins. It makes all kinds of proteins. It stores up energy in the form of starch from glucose until we need it. And then it breaks it down again to glucose and gives it to the body as we need it. Incredible organ. And then there's all the other plumbing that we don't really care much about. The only thing I'll say about the intestines is that it is 22% efficient at extracting energy. What did I say? 22% is 22 feet long. 95% efficient at extracting energy from food. And again, it's no wonder it's so hard for us to lose weight. Our body is just too good. Now, a very reliable source that I came across studying for this informed me that your stomach, if you do yoga, is very happy. So, it was there, I have to believe it. So do yoga and you'll have a happy stomach. And if you're musically inclined, eat the musical fruit and compose your own score. Next slide. We're going to skip the skeletal system. We don't have time. Oh! I came across this, and I know that this is true. This is a transitional form between the modern cowboy and horse and the previous horse-cowboy fusion figure. So this is proof of evolutionary transitional form that gave rise to what we see in the West today. Next slide. Yeah. So this, we can't talk about this, we don't have time. But this is muscle. And the muscle has little ratchet proteins. Proteins, right? Where do we get the information to make the protein? Oh. Okay, so more proteins. There's a layer of actin, and there's this myosin, and these cute little things on here. And when energy is released, calcium allows areas to be exposed, and they go, boop, and then they release, and they go, boop. And that's one of the ways that you can do this, is because of what your muscle is doing. But it doesn't tell us how it got activated. It doesn't tell us about the motor input, or the neurons from the brain down through the spinal cord to your muscles. Next slide. All right. So, how many senses do we have? Next slide. Oh, you guys are good. 5 senses. We're only going to look at sight and hearing. We're only going to do it. Are you guys okay?
Yeah, we are. We're fine.
Okay. if you can't stand it anymore, I understand, but this is about you. And, you know, I mean, maybe you're not that interested. So we're just going to look at sight and hearing briefly. The one thing I like to say about touch, you know, people talk about pain and they say pain is very painful, and I don't like it. But do you know a disease where pain is eliminated? Anybody know?
Leprosy.
Leprosy, right? Leprosy is a bacteria that very slowly attacks the sensory nerves. What happens when you can't feel pain? You don't know you're hurting yourself, right? You can stick your hand in the fire and your fingers get third-degree burns and you don't know it until you smell it. And that's what happened to lepers. They would lose their fingers because they would injure them until they couldn't heal anymore. They would lose their noses because they would get burned or they would get frostbite or whatever. They would lose their ears for the same. Pain is a gift to us, one that we wish we didn't need to have. But in this world, it's very important that we're able to touch. So anyway, I wasn't even supposed to talk about that. Let's go to, next slide. Oh, I just like this one, right? 5 senses, can you make them out? I thought that was so neat. Okay, next. So sight the eye, go to the next one, please. Okay, cross-section of an eye. All right, and so this is an amazing organ. And, you know, the intelligent designers, I don't think I mentioned this to you at the beginning, but I guess I did. The intelligent designers want to tell us that this organ is irreducibly complex. You can't take it apart into its sub-pieces and have anything that works. So how did it come together to work? And of course, evolutionists, and they may be correct, say that gradually, little photosensitive spots on the organism started to develop into little cups and then the cups. Okay, so maybe, I'm not 100% convinced, but maybe. I was brought up on evolutionary theory, by the way. My paper in high school was a paper about how life could have originated from non-living stuff. So I'm interested in this, and yet, as I learn more about complexity, I wonder. Okay, so we have the focusing part of the eye. The cornea starts the process. The lens continues the process. Okay, I want you to think hard about adjusting your lens for here. Think about it. How are we doing? Okay, now I want you to think about adjusting your lens for looking at your hand. Think about it. Were you able to, can you do that? That happens automatically. There are these little muscles, and they pull the lens to adjust the refraction, depending on whether we're looking close or far. And of course, what happens when you get to be an old guy like me is the lens gets less flexible. It can't accommodate as well. That's why we need reading glasses. Some of us have needed glasses all our lives because we're basically malformed. So, next slide. Okay, so now this is so neat. Okay, this is the retina of the eye. This is the back, this is what we see with, right? Okay, so we've got rods here, and we have these cone-shaped cells, and this is the retina. This is where the light is coming from, and this is the back of the eyeball. And so the light comes in, and it's really nice because the rods pick up low light, but they're only able to convert that into black, white, gray images. But somebody gave us cones. And fortunately, he made them in different colors so we could tell what they do. Not really. Okay? But the rods, they're very light sensitive. It's been found that 1 or 2 photons, does everybody know what a photon is? A little package of light, the smallest package? 1 or 2 photons can actually trigger a rod cell's fire. 1 or 2 photons. In fact, on a clear New Mexico, moonless New Mexico night, darkest night that you can think of, you can see a candle flame 30 miles away. That's how sensitive the rods are to just small amounts of light. But we can't see color at those levels because it takes much more light for the cones to be stimulated. Okay? We have 120 million rods, we have 7 million cones in each retina. Some computer guy, and I know nothing about computers, so I don't know if this is right, but he wanted to try to recreate what the eye brain does with a computer. And he figured that for 10 milliseconds of vision, the brain has to solve 500 nonlinear differential equations 100 times per cell. Per cell. We've got 120 million of these cells all feeding through. How do you do that? Now, what I want you to do for a second, okay? Not yet. I'll tell you when. But I want you to think about somebody that you really care about, that you have a good relationship with. And I want you to think about some pleasant experience that you had in a restaurant that you dined at. Let's say a restaurant, okay? And I want you to think about the smells that were there and the colors. And now I want you to close your eyes for 10 seconds, and I want you to see if you can recreate that. Go. Close your eyes. 10 seconds. Ten seconds is it. How'd you do? Could you do it? There's somebody out here that doesn't have a friend. I can see it on your face. But for the rest of us, how do you do that? It's one thing to take the stimulus in and to create the image. How do you store that much information? And how do you bring it back like that? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay. So, the interesting, our brain is so good with this color stuff that we can, and my sister is an artist, she's here, and she'll confirm this, we can actually distinguish between 1 million different hues of color. And if you don't believe it, just go paint shopping with your wife. There is no green paint. There may be desert sage, but there's never green. Right? I mean, and why? Why? Why are you able to see color? Do you need to see color to be able to survive in this world? What is the evolutionary benefit of color to us? What a gift. What a gift to have these colors. Imagine a sunset that was just shades of gray. We would appreciate it because we wouldn't know anything different. But how much more glorious is it because we have color? Think about it. Okay, let's see. Now, you know, the thing that we haven't even talked about is look around the room. Look over there at that vent there for a minute. Look over there at the exit sign. Right? How did you do that? How did you get your eyes to move together instead of this way? To look where you wanted to go, and then automatically focus on it, just like that, without even thinking about it. We haven't even talked about the muscles that move the eyes around that give us binocular vision. Remember when you were a kid and you crossed your eyes like that, and your mother said they're going to get stuck like that? Well, they're not really going to do that. But we can control the muscles to a certain extent, but it happens automatically when we're not thinking about it. Okay, so I think we did okay with that. Let's go on to hearing, briefly hearing the ear. Next slide. There's an ear. Great little mechanism. Very impressive. Our ears can handle intensity of sound on an order of magnitude of 1 trillion from the to the very loudest sound. And the energies that are required to do this are very small. It's been shown that if the eardrum moves the distance of a hydrogen molecule, that will trigger sound in the ear. That's pretty small. That's not much energy. The only time that the energy of sound is impressive is when you have a teenager living in your house. But otherwise, the softest sounds that we hear produce an energy equivalent to 2/10,000ths of a dyne per square centimeter. That's a measure of force, 2/10,000ths. A mosquito jumping off your skin generates a dyne of pressure. Very tiny pressures are magnified by these wonderful little bones transmitted to the cochlea, these little fine fibers that pick up the motion and convey that by the auditory nerve to the brain. We're able to distinguish 2,000 pitches. Can you tell if you hear a sound, can you locate where it's coming from? How do you do that? How do you do that? Do you know that the difference in the sound getting from one ear, the difference in the arrival of the sound between ears can be as little as 3/100,000ths of a second? 3/100,000ths of a second difference, and you can say, oh, it's not straight ahead, it's over there. 3/100,000ths of a second. How do you do that? How does the brain interpret that? The ear is not only responsible for hearing, but it's got these wonderful little semicircular canals that help us with our balance. Okay, and they're oriented this way and this way and this way, so that we can tell where we are unless we get vertigo. And then we hate that little part of the ear, right? Because then it keeps sending a message to the brain that we're moving when we're not. So, not everything always works the way it should. Interesting now, ears begin to develop in the baby at 3 weeks along, going from a low Mr. zygote to a 3-week-old embryo. The ears start to develop. By 16 weeks, they can pick up sound. By 28 weeks, the baby responds to the mother's voice, specifically when the baby is born. The baby recognizes the mother's voice compared to other adults in life. Okay? So we're already learning, even as we're in the womb. What I didn't mention to you, going back to the heart for just a second, this is so impressive, I'm sorry I forgot. But at 3 weeks of age, like the ears are starting to form, the heart is also starting to form. There are a bunch of little excitatory cells there, a little bit like this, but they're not formed in anything. But guess what? By 14 weeks, somehow this little becomes this. And it has chambers, and it beats, and it circulates, get this, 7 gallons of blood per 24 hours at 14 weeks. 7 gallons of blood a day. Now, you circulate about 2,000 gallons of blood, but you're bigger. Right? 14 weeks, that baby is circulating 7 gallons of blood. 28 weeks, this baby knows its mother. Its heart rate will respond to the mother's voice. God gave us ears to hear. Do we use them to listen to Him or not? Next slide. Oh, sorry I included this. But this is do-it-yourself hearing aids. And, hearing is something that we do have problems with as we get older. This gentleman has found the perfect solution. Inexpensive yet effective. A couple of styrofoam cups cut out. And you see his wife only has to yell a little less loudly than she was doing. So that works for her. Okay. I don't know why that's it. Next slide. Brain and the nervous system. Okay. I have about an hour and a half's worth of information on this. And every time I gave this talk to myself, this is about where I would fall asleep. So I'm trying to really kind of condense this. I don't know if it will be coherent at all or not, because I just cut stuff out. Next slide, please. So here we have a man and his wife, and they're coming out of the doctor's office, and she says, "The doctor is supposed to get on your nerves, George. He's a neurologist." Okay, next slide. Okay, brain. I like this picture. It doesn't really depict anything except that it's a brain. Okay, just bring up the next slide for a second. There we go. This is Isaac Asimov. How many people have heard of Isaac Asimov? Very famous science fiction writer, brilliant gentleman, pretty much an atheist. This is what he said. Brain is a 3-pound mass of neurons. That much we pretty much know. The most complex and orderly arrangement in the universe. We're talking about the most important entity in the physical universe, which is you. And this is why. Next slide, please. We're able to increasingly identify different parts of the brain and what it does. But we're still not that good. I mean, we know where the motor strips are that do this kind of stuff for us. We know more and more about memory, sensations, but we still have a pretty limited understanding of how the brain integrates all this into a coherent whole. And you know, it's been said that we only use 10% of our brain. And that if we just learned how to use the other 60%, the world would be better. But in fact, those areas that we consider silent in the brain are not silent. They're active all the time. When you sleep is one of the times when your brain is the most active. How many people have gone to bed with a problem and woken up in the middle of the night with a solution? Yes, right? Because your brain is working. How many times has that solution been really, really bizarre? So it doesn't always work that well, but this is a very creative time, and sleep is not wasted time as far as the brain is concerned. Now the brain is made up, as we know, of neurons, individual nerve cells. Here's an artist's depiction of these cells. And there are about between 10 and 100 billion nerve cells in the brain. We're still waiting for the graduate student to do the count, so we don't know exactly. But that's not the remarkable part. I mean, 10 billion is a lot, 100 billion is a lot more, but each one of these nerve cells, as it develops, forms contacts with surrounding nerve cells. And each nerve cell, by the time we're an adult, makes contact with, let me put it a different way, it has 10,000 contacts with other cells. Okay, so these little things, these keep branching out, and these ones are branching out. This is where the impulse comes in, this is where it goes to the next cells. 10,000 connections per nerve cell, there are maybe 100 billion nerve cells. That comes out to 100 trillion neurologic interconnections, which comes out to 10 to the 14th bits of potential information storage, which, by the way, is enough bits of information to store 25 million books. 8 million more books that are in the Library of Congress. How do you do that? How do you do that? The information processing capacity of the brain is basically unimaginable. That's why we can produce these visual images that seem to require all the solution of differential equations going on continuously, integrating into something that makes sense to the world around us. But we don't really understand all the complexity involved in that. Next slide. So here I am, right? I'm a neuron. I get excited. And my impulse goes. And here I am, I'm going between 200 and 400 miles an hour down the neuron to the next cell. Literally, between 200 and 400 miles an hour along that cell. Guess what happens? I'm in my Bugatti. I'm going as fast as it'll go. Then I get to the synapse. And now I got to put my Bugatti on a ferry boat to get across the river. That's what the synapse is. We're zipping along here, and all of a sudden we get to the end, and there's this little cleft. Now we've got to take these little chemical packets. We've got to get them here, put the chemical in this little gap, and have it be taken up on the other side. Why? Why do we do it that way? It seems slow. It takes a thousandth of a second to do this. Why would anybody want to wait that long? But if you think about it, if there was no barrier to conduction and one cell fired, what would happen? All our cells would be firing. We wouldn't be able to control it. You know, epilepsy basically is when the brain loses control of neuronal firing, and the whole brain starts firing off all at once. So it's a problem. But there are very interesting things, and there have been a lot of study on this, because these are neurotransmitters, all right? And this is what's necessary to get the impulse across here. Guess what happens if you don't make enough of it? Doesn't get you right. But very many fewer of the nerve cells on the other side are able to get stimulated. What happens when people become clinically depressed? The serotonin here gets used up, it gets depleted. There's not enough chemical to stimulate the cell on the other side. And our thought process become disordered as a result of it. Parkinson's disease. dopamine is depleted in certain portions of the brain. And we can help it by replacing some of the dopamine, only up to a point. There are actually 100 different neurotransmitters, which, by the way, are proteins, which are coded for by DNA. Very complex mechanisms. Depression is one thing that can occur. So what do? We give medicines that prevent this stuff from being broken down once it gets out here, so that there's a better chance of things getting across. The one thing I wanted to mention was many neurotransmitters stimulate the next cell to fire. But you know, there are a bunch of them that cause the next cell to be more resistant to being fired, so that we don't have this business of all of our cells working at once. Anybody ever read a book? When you read a book, do you spend a lot of time thinking about how your butt hurts? Or breathing, or how fast your heart is. Do you think about a lot of other things? No. Why? Because we have a lot of nerve cells that inhibit information that's not needed at the time. People with depression are not able to do that as well, and they have trouble concentrating, focusing. They have trouble screening out thoughts that they don't want. Next slide, please. Memory and thought. This is where I had a lot of stuff. Go to the next slide. So, it's been said that if we were just simpler organisms, we might be able to figure out how all this really works. But if we were simpler organisms, we wouldn't care. Right? We're the only organism that considers these things, that has a curiosity to say, how do I work? How does this happen? Next slide. So we have ideas. Now, do you know that the brain generates 20 watts of energy? Electrical energy, chemical energy, all the time? Yeah. That's true because I read it somewhere. But it is true. So we know that our brains are very active, but what we don't really know is, how do we think? How does a man like Albert Einstein, who has been brought up with Newtonian mechanics, figure out that there is general relativity that changes the whole paradigm of how we think about the world around us? How does he come up with ideas like that that have nothing to do with his day-to-day existence, really? How do people come up with ideas like quantum mechanics? Albert Einstein hated quantum mechanics. You know, he said it's like God playing with dice, and yet all of the experimental evidence suggests that quantum mechanics actually is the way the physical universe functions. How does that happen? We don't know. Just a couple things about memory. We apparently have memory traces. So remember you thought back a few minutes ago about a place that you were with a person or all this. And you can bring those memories back. And it's because when the memory is formed, different cells from different parts of the brain fire together. And as they do that, they form what's called a memory trace. The more times we think about that thought, the more times electrical activity is occurring in those groups of neurons. And what happens then if we go back to those neurons is they're making new little connections with the cells in that memory trace. And it's thought that that's one of the ways that we can recall a specific memory. But when I talk to you about thinking about the smells and the colors and the person and maybe the way the food tasted, you can do all that. But to do that, do you know what you have to do? You have to access parts of your brain that store olfactory smell memories, that store visual memories, different place, that store touch memories, different place. You have to bring all of that together and integrate it. How do you do that? I can't remember where I left my keys. How is it that we're able to recall these things? So just mentioning that for a minute, the short-term memory, 7 items is what you're allowed in the short-term memory. More than that, they get kicked out. It lasts for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So if you have a concussion, it's gone. You're not going to remember it. My wife will tell you that's true. It was not physical abuse, just so you know. But she did have concussion one time. So that memory is lost. But, and usually we don't worry about it. That's just what we use for operating minute by minute, day by day. But if it's something important, if it's an episode associated with some intense emotion, that information is going to get stored in our brains. Most of us are old enough to remember what we were doing when John Kennedy was shot 50 years ago. Something with an intense emotional component to it gets stored in a very real way. It's actually been shown that learning does not depend on how much time we spend studying, guys. This is great news for you. It has to do with whether there's emotional content involved with what you're studying or a semantic content. In other words, if there's some sort of a framework that makes sense to you that you can plug this new information into. It's much easier to learn it than if it's something that you cannot associate with anything else. So figure out associations, and you won't have to study as much. Okay. Just a couple other things. We have in the frontal lobes, we have these sort of loops that play all the time, okay? One of them is word related, and the other is visually related. And they're playing all the time. If you're alone by yourself, you're not reading a book or something like that, do you talk to yourself? Well, I have to tell you, that's a mark of psychosis. But if you're not saying it out loud, then it's okay. But we think this loop, we think in 800 words a minute. That's why it's so easy to make a fool of yourself if you don't think about what you're going to say before you say it. But that creates our inner voice. Some people would say that's what creates our mind or our soul. It's what we can't tangibly put our fingers on when we look at structure. You know, it's like looking at computer hardware and then trying to figure out how the software works from just looking at the hardware. We really can't quite do that. But this is really what our mind is, and it's going all the time. And we have the streaming of our memories, our inner voice. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that we can't force ourselves to forget. Right? Because what happens? If we recall a memory, right, what does that do? It reinforces the neurons that fire together to cause us to remember that. Well, if we remember something to say, I'm going to forget that, what have we just done? The only way to start forgetting something is not to think about it. The Bible says to forgive and forget. And the way to do that is by forgiving, not to remember the offense that occurred. All right? One interesting thing, post-traumatic stress disorder, they are finding that if you give people certain medicines, beta blockers, you can actually promote forgetting, which is a new concept and may be helpful in people. Okay, the last thing about memory is procedural memory. And, you know, we talked about this before, this kind of thing. And when you're eating, you don't really think about it so much, right? So, procedural memory, when we're little, you see kids walk, right? Right? When they're learning to walk, right? But as they're doing that, they're creating memory traces that say, oh, this one works, this one doesn't, right? And so they're learning, and that's actually a kind of memory. It's called procedural memory. And when we get good at it, then we don't have to think about it anymore. So I can walk, and I can think, I'm going to have lunch with my friend at Sakar Springs Brewery, and I'm going to walk over. Do I think about walking? Do I think about what muscles I have to use? Do I think about proprioception, where I'm placing my foot? Do I think about my balance? I do all those things automatically. It's procedural memory. We can do it without thinking about it once we get good. A concert pianist can play mostly using procedural memory and not consciously thinking about all the movements that they have to make. But if you're learning to play an instrument, first months are pretty painful, aren't they? Because you don't know nothing. Okay? And you have to learn it. And that, again, has to do with this idea that the neurons, there's neural plasticity. The neurons are making new connections as they do this over and over. Okay. Next slide. That's a brain. I forgot to put that up. Next slide. So, just one word about language. Language is unique for man, isn't it? Some animals we can teach maybe a couple of hundred words, but we don't really know that they think of those words. They just know the sound and know that some response is rewarded. But we know language. Language is the basis of our relationships. It's about communication. It's about love, right? Loving people. It connects us to other people in a way that nothing else really can. Language is a unique gift to human beings. Next slide, we'll just put it up as a visual. So there are people talking. Now you think that talking is pretty easy, really. But let me give you this quote from David Myers that was in that little book I told you about. He says language isn't easy. He says, to transfer verbal thoughts to speech, we have to learn to monitor the muscles of speech, our tongue, our lips, and all that stuff. We have to be able to do that. We have to order syntax. We have to watch out for those little semantic catastrophes, right? Where a small change in word order can embarrass us severely. And that, of course, is the plague of anybody learning a different language. You're always making these little semantic catastrophes because you don't really understand the language. So you have to be able to do that. You have to continuously adjust your tone of voice, your facial expressions, and doing all of this, at the end of it, you're supposed to say something meaningful. Language isn't easy. It's not easy. It's a gift that we have that allows us to communicate with other people. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you that we actually are getting to the end. Next slide. Sir John Eccles, brain researcher, Nobel laureate in medicine and physiology, says, unfortunately, many scientists don't understand the limits of the discipline studying the brain. They argue that someday science will explain values, beauty, love, friendship, aesthetics, literary quality, I would say music. They say all of these will eventually be explicable in terms of brain performance. We only have to know more about the brain. That view is nothing more than superstition that confuses both the public and scientists. Friends, we're more complex than that. I don't know how you do it every day. I don't know how you're able to capture all this surrounding data and process it into something that's meaningful to you. I don't know how you do it. Next slide. Okay. Oh, thank God. Okay. Let me just see what the next slide is. So, summing up, okay, whether we're an atheist or agnostic or a theist, if we believe in God, if we believe in the Christian God, or we believe in Allah, I hope it's reasonable to say that at the end of this, that we can say that the human body represents a complexity that is indeed awesome and marvelous and just kind of fun to think about. Can we agree on that after this? And I just love the eyes, right? I mean, this is the way I used to be when I was talking to people about this at dinner time. When I was a kid, everything used to be wow, wow, wow. And then I got to be older, it's like, oh, geez, not again. You know? This is, if we think about things, this is the way we should feel again. Like you're a little kid, like the world is something wonderful to explore. And that our human bodies are just incredibly complex and an incredible gift. Give me the next slide. So, oops, that's not the one I wanted yet, but that's okay. We'll leave that up. But, so this guy, Richard Swenson, in his book, quotes this: if we observe design, it's not wrong to infer a designer. Okay? It's not wrong. You may not agree with it, but people that think that maybe there's a designer, that's not necessarily a wrong thought to have. When we see this complexity, this amount of information, it's not wrong to infer a designer. If we observe life, it's not wrong to infer a life giver. If we see DNA, it is not wrong to infer the precision of a genius. If we see information and intelligence and intention, it's not wrong to infer that behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadow. And the Lord, the Bible has some discussion about man's wisdom. I don't know if you've been reading these as I've been talking or not. But I think one of the ones that's really important for our current age is your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, I am, and there's none besides me. When I was a younger man, this is what I thought. And I have to tell you, one of the hardest things about coming to faith was my pride. And somehow thinking that there could be anything in the universe smarter than me. Right? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of our scientists are plagued by this hubris, which says, because I am able to understand so much about the universe, there can't be something smarter than me that created it. Right? And I would suggest to you that being able to tease apart the creation and being able to understand it is not the same thing as creating it. Right? God has given us these incredible brains, and I can't believe, since I started in medical school, how much information has been developed in that period of time, how much more knowledge about how DNA works, about the cell works, about the human body works. I can't believe how much more information there is. And yet, science is not the enemy of our faith. Science is a reinforcer of it, because every time we make a new discovery, we find out how much more complex we are as an organism, how much more complex our universe is. Astrophysicists tell us there are approximately 119 conditions that must exist in the universe in a precise way for there to be able to be life on Earth. 119 different conditions precisely. If the universe expanded too quickly, it would fly apart. If it didn't expand quickly enough, it would implode back on itself. Everything is fine-tuned. We don't know why. We can think that it happened by chance, and perhaps it did. Next slide. Within the miracle of the human body, there is sanctity, hope, and glory. Such a creator is rightly regarded with awe. Awesomely, wonderfully made we are. I believe that there's an afterlife, but if I do experience that, when I get there, I hope that this is not what I hear being said about me. Next slide, please. You realize that every one of us have the same doctor. Next slide, please. So, if we start to feel that our problems are overwhelming, I just told you that you are the most unique entity in the known universe, but at the same time, it's very important that we put all of this in perspective. And all of you have seen this before, I'm sure. This is a picture taken from Voyager as it left our solar system, looking back at the Earth. Here we are on this little speck. If we start thinking we're too important, it's a good idea to look at it from a different perspective. Okay? So I hope that's been entertaining to you. I know it's gone long. You've been wonderfully attentive. I only saw a few people nodding off, including myself. And considering how long it took us to get through this, you've been incredibly patient. I appreciate it. And again, Dr. Jackson.